The gala lights blurred into gold as gunfire cracked outside the ballroom, and Nadia froze mid-step, her heart slamming against her ribs. A stranger's hand closed around her wrist, pulling her behind a marble pillar, his body shielding hers from the chaos. She looked up into eyes dark as midnight, and something in her chest cracked open, awakening a hunger she never knew she carried. Welcome to Afro-Korean romance, where love has no borders. If you believe in love, like, share, and subscribe for more Afro-Korean romance stories. The gala had been her cousin's idea, a chance for Nadia to finally find someone, as her aunties loved to say at every family gathering, usually right after glancing at her bare left hand and clicking their tongues. She was 31, curvy, brilliant, running her own design studio, and still somehow the punchline of every family dinner. Empty ring finger again, her mother had sighed just that morning, as if Nadia's worth lived inside a diamond. She'd come to the gala anyway, chin high, red dress hugging every curve she refused to apologize for. Then the gunfire started, and Kang Min-ho found her. He was not supposed to be at that gala. Min-ho ran half the shipping lanes on the peninsula and most of what moved beneath them, a man whose name made grown men sweat through their suits. He'd come only to settle a debt quietly, but when chaos erupted and a woman in red stumbled backward into his path, something in him simply moved before he decided to. He pulled her to safety without thinking, and when she looked up at him, breathless and trembling but not crying, not begging, just furious and alive, he felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in 15 years of careful numbness. "Safe," he said, voice low and even though his pulse was not. "Who are you?" She demanded, even as her body still shook against his arm. He didn't answer. He never gave his name to strangers. But he didn't let go of her hand until security cleared the room, and even then, he watched her walk away like a man watching something he already knew he wanted to keep. The next day, flowers arrived at her studio. No card, no name, just white orchids, her favorite, which she hadn't told a single soul. Nadia stared at them for a long moment, unsettled and strangely thrilled, before tossing the thought aside as coincidence. It wasn't coincidence. 3 days later, he came in person, dressed in a charcoal suit that made the air in her studio feel smaller. "Kang Min-ho," he said simply, extending a hand. "I believe I owe you a proper introduction." Nadia crossed her arms, refusing to let her racing pulse show on her face. "You don't owe me anything. You pulled me behind a pillar." That's not exactly a relationship starter. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "I'd like to change that." She should have said no. Everything about him screamed danger. The way his security lingered outside her door, the way people on the street seemed to part for him without being asked. But there was something else beneath the danger, something careful and quiet in the way he looked at her, like she mattered more than the empire he commanded. By the end of the week, he was finding reasons to appear. Coffee left at her studio door each morning, exactly the way she liked it, though she'd never told him. A car waiting outside when it rained, before she'd even stepped out to look for a taxi. She told herself it was unwanted attention. She told her best friend it was suffocating. She told herself a lot of things that weren't true. A few days later, at a dinner her mother insisted she attend, her cousin made a joke about her empty ring finger again, and the table laughed the way it always did, soft and careless and cutting. Nadia smiled the way she always did, swallowing the sting. She didn't notice the man standing near the restaurant entrance until her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number that she somehow already knew. "I heard that. They're wrong about you." Her hand trembled around her phone. That evening, he showed up at her apartment, uninvited, jaw tight with something she hadn't seen in him before, real anger, banked low and controlled. "Who laughs at a woman like that?" he said, more to himself than to her, "and calls it love?" "You were there," she whispered. "Always nearby," he admitted, and for the first time there was no smoothness in his voice, only truth. She should have been afraid of how easily he'd found her, how deeply he'd already woven himself into her life. Instead, something in her softened toward him, dangerous and warm. Their world collided fully 2 weeks later, at a charity auction where a wealthy investor named Daniel cornered her at the bar, his hand lingering too long on her arm, his compliments sliding from charming into something else. Nadia handled it the way she always handled unwanted attention, calm, firm, unmoved. But across the room, Min-ho watched, his glass frozen halfway to his lips, his expression unreadable to everyone except the men who worked for him and knew exactly what that stillness meant. He crossed the room without hurry, slid an arm around her waist like it belonged there, and said only, "She's with me," in a voice that left no room for argument. Daniel paled and excused himself immediately. "I didn't need rescuing," Nadia said afterward, irritation and something warmer tangled together in her chest. "I know," Min-ho said. "I wasn't doing it for you. I did it because I couldn't stand watching another man touch what's mine." Her breath caught. "I'm not yours." His eyes darkened, and he leaned close enough that she felt his words more than heard them. "Not yet." Following week brought the catalyst that changed everything. A storm rolled in hard and sudden, stranding them both at his penthouse after a business dinner that had run long. Lightning split the sky as the city lost power, and in the dark, stripped of distance and pretense, the walls between them finally came down. She admitted, voice shaking, how tired she was of being laughed at, of being told her life wasn't whole without a ring. He admitted, just as quietly, that he hadn't let himself want anything in years, not since he'd buried the people who'd once made him soft, until her. In the candlelight, with the storm howling outside, he cupped her face like she was something precious and breakable, and she let him. What followed was not spoken of in detail, only felt. The closeness, the trembling breath between them, the way two guarded hearts finally stopped fighting the pull that had been building since the night gunfire first threw them together. By morning, everything between them had changed. And by morning, Nadia was terrified. She left before he woke, slipping out into the gray dawn, certain that what had happened in the dark would look different in daylight, that he'd see her clearly now and decide she wasn't enough, that powerful men like him didn't keep women like her, not really. She turned off her phone and disappeared into work, into silence, into the old fear that love was something other people got to keep. Min-ho did not let her disappear. He tore through the city searching, calling in every favor, every contact, his calm unraveling into something raw and desperate that none of his men had ever witnessed. When he finally found her at her studio late that night, he didn't shout. He simply stood in the doorway, breathing hard, and said, "Do you think I let people walk away from me because I don't care? I came because I care too much to let you believe, even for one night, that you weren't wanted." "You don't know what you're getting into," she whispered, eyes glassy. "My family doesn't even believe I deserve love. What happens when you realize they're right?" "They're not right," he said, crossing the room, taking her face in his hands again, gentler this time. "You are the only thing in this life that's ever made me feel like more than what I do for a living. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to let me love you anyway." She broke then, tears finally falling, and he held her like she was the only steady thing in a world built on danger. But danger had not finished with them yet. Word had reached a rival syndicate, the Beek family, that Min-ho had a weakness now, a woman he'd protect at any cost, and weaknesses in their world were currency. Within days, Nadia was followed, her studio broken into, a warning note left on her desk in neat, cruel handwriting. "Walk away from him or we'll make sure you regret staying." She didn't tell him at first, too afraid of what he might do, too afraid of dragging him deeper into danger because of her. But he found the note anyway, and the fury that moved through him was quiet and absolute, the kind that made even his own men step back. "You should have told me," he said, voice low. "I didn't want you to start a war over me." "Late," he said. "I'd burn down every empire I own before I let them touch you." He moved her into his penthouse that night, security tripled, eyes everywhere, and still it wasn't enough. A week later, while Nadia left a meeting alone, against his explicit warning, 2 men forced her into a car in broad daylight, and the city she loved became a cage of fear in an instant. When Min-ho got the call, something in him went terrifyingly still. He didn't yell, he didn't break anything. He simply said, "Find her. Now!" in a voice so calm it frightened the men around him more than rage ever could. For 36 hours, he tore through every safe house, every contact, every favor owed to him across a decade of careful power, refusing food, refusing rest, refusing to consider any outcome but her safety. When his men finally traced her to a warehouse on the city's edge, he was the first through the door, gun steady, eyes burning with something far past fear. He found her bound but unbroken, chin lifted in defiance even with fear written plain across her face, and the sight of her alive nearly brought him to his knees. He crossed the room in 3 strides, cut her free himself, and pulled her against his chest so tightly she could feel his heart hammering as hard as her own. "I'm here," he murmured against her hair, voice cracking for the first time since she'd known him. "I'm here. You're safe. I will never let anyone touch you again." Behind them, his men dealt with the Beek family's men in ways that ensured no one would dare threaten Nadia again. The message sent that night rippled through every syndicate in the city. Kang Min-ho's woman was untouchable, and so, by extension, was he. He took her home, refusing to let her out of his sight, sitting beside her bed through the night even after the doctor confirmed she was unharmed, his hand wrapped around hers like he was still afraid she might vanish. "I thought I lost you," he admitted quietly, in the dark, his guard fully down for the first time in his life. 15 years I told myself I didn't need anyone. Then you walked into my life covered in gunfire and laughter and you ruined all of it. I'm not sorry. I'd let the whole city burn before I lose you." Nadia reached up and touched his jaw, the man the world feared reduced to something achingly tender beneath her palm. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. "Not anymore." By the end of that week, word had spread through her family, too, not of danger but of devotion, of a man who'd torn the city apart to bring her home safely. Her cousins, who once laughed at her empty ring finger, fell silent when Min-ho appeared at her family's door himself, formally, respectfully, asking her father for nothing less than permission to marry her. "She has spent her whole life being told she wasn't chosen," he said to her stunned family, his voice steady and unshaken. "I am here to make sure she never hears that again." He proposed 3 days later, not in some grand spectacle, but quietly, on the rooftop where they'd first truly spoken after the storm, the same city lights spread beneath them that had once witnessed gunfire and fear, now witnessing something entirely different. He knelt, opened a small box holding a ring far simpler than anyone expected from a man of his power, and said only, "Your finger has been empty long enough. Let me be the reason it never is again." Nadia said yes through tears, laughing and crying all at once, finally, fully chosen. Their wedding came months later, modest by his world standards but glowing with a warmth few in his life had ever witnessed. Her family seated proudly in the front row, the same aunties who'd once laughed now wiping their eyes, her mother holding her hand and whispering an apology Nadia had waited years to hear. Min-ho stood at the altar in quiet wonder, a man who once ruled through fear now undone completely by love. A year later, in their home filled finally with warmth instead of danger, Nadia placed his hand gently against her stomach, watching the disbelief and joy break across his face like dawn breaking over the city that had once nearly taken everything from them. "Going to be a father," she whispered. He said nothing for a long moment, only pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Then I have everything," he murmured. "Everything I never let myself want, you gave me anyway." Outside, the city moved on, unaware that somewhere above its restless lights, a man who once commanded fear now lived only to protect the love he'd almost lost, and the family he'd never believed he deserved, finally, completely, his. The peace did not come without one final test. In her 7th month, complications sent Nadia to the hospital in the middle of the night, and for the first time since the warehouse, Min-ho felt the cold grip of helplessness close around him again, this time with no enemy to hunt, no rival to threaten, nothing but waiting rooms and silence. He paced the corridor for hours, refusing every chair offered to him, his usual composure stripped away to something raw and human. When the doctor finally emerged to tell him mother and child were both stable, his knees nearly buckled with relief. He walked into her room and found her pale but smiling weakly, and he sat beside her bed the way he had after the warehouse, holding her hand like it was the only thing keeping the world steady. "You scared me," he said quietly. "I scared myself," she admitted, managing a tired laugh. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, voice low and certain. "Whatever it takes, however many nights I have to sit beside this bed, I will always be here. That was never a question." Weeks that followed slowed into something gentler. He cleared his schedule in ways his own men had never seen, delegating empire matters he once guarded jealously, choosing instead to repaint a nursery himself, badly, with paint on his sleeves and a quiet kind of joy on his face that no boardroom had ever given him. Nadia would catch him sometimes, standing in the doorway of the half-finished nursery, simply staring at the crib like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Her family visited often now, the distance of old judgments replaced by something warmer. Her mother knit tiny sweaters in the evenings, murmuring apologies disguised as fussing over yarn colors. Even her cousin, the one who'd once mocked her bare ring finger the loudest, sent a long, tearful message admitting she'd never imagined Nadia would end up this loved, this safe, this whole. On the night their daughter was born, the city outside glittered the same as it always had, indifferent to the small, fierce sound of a new cry filling a hospital room. Min-ho held his daughter for the first time with hands that had once held weapons without hesitation, and now trembled holding something so small and so entirely his to protect. "She has your stubbornness already," he murmured, voice thick, watching the baby's tiny fist curl around his finger. "She has your eyes," Nadia whispered back, exhausted and radiant. He looked at his wife then, at the life they had built from gunfire and storms and stolen orchids, and said the only thing that felt true enough to hold the moment. "I spent 15 years believing power was the only thing worth protecting. You taught me it was never the empire. It was always going to be this." Years later, their daughter would grow up never once doubting she was wanted, never once made to feel that love was something to be earned or laughed away. And Nadia, who had once sat at family dinners enduring quiet jokes about an empty ring finger, would catch herself sometimes glancing down at the ring that never left her hand, and smile. Not because the world had finally decided she deserved love, but because she had let a dangerous, devoted man prove it to her, one fearless act at a time, until there was no doubt left at all.